In Romans 5:20, Paul says God's law was given so that all people could see how sinful they were. Likewise, in Galatians 3:19, he says that the law was given to show people their sins. Many readers today see these verses and conclude that the law of God given to his people in the Old Testament was created with the purpose of being impossible to follow. So they would try to follow the law, but it's too hard, and then they would realize their need for a Savior who would be Jesus. But wouldn't it be grossly unfair of God to deliberately set humanity up for failure? Here's the problem. Jerusalem was destroyed and the Israelites were exiled into a foreign land in the 6th century BC because they failed to keep the law of God. Reading Paul, are we really saying that God intentionally created impossible laws and then punished his people for not following them? I don't think this is correct. In Deuteronomy 30:11, Moses was talking about the entirety of God's law when he said, "For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off." In other words, the law of God was not designed to be impossible. In Matthew 19:8, Jesus gives an example of how God's law was actually accommodating for morally corrupt people. This wouldn't make sense if the law was designed to be impossible. Obviously, nobody's perfect, and the law recognizes this and has a sacrificial system built into it. But that's different than saying that the law was designed to produce failure. If that were the case, then failure to keep the law would be because of the law and not because of the people. God gave the law as a way for his people to have access into his presence. This shows us that in its essence, the law was intended for life. So what does Paul mean when he says that the law was given so that people could see how sinful they were? Well, it seems to me that Paul is focusing on a different purpose of the law. By defining right from wrong, the law makes it clear how to identify something that is wrong. When we can identify wrongness, we can identify sin. That was also a purpose of the law. This sin deprived the law of its life-giving purpose, just as it robbed Adam and Eve of the life-sustaining garden. It became clear that because of sin, the people were unwilling to follow the law. Not that they couldn't follow it, but that they didn't want to. Paul fleshes out this concept further in Romans 7, being very careful to distinguish the goodness of the law from the infection of sin. So the law served a dual purpose. On the one hand, it created an opportunity for God to dwell among his people. This, I believe, is the primary purpose of the law when we study the first 5 books in the Old Testament. But on the other hand, Paul sees what the law ended up becoming in hindsight, namely a signal pointing to our need for something even better that could never be corrupted by sin. Even still, the law of God in the Old Testament is still relevant for Christians today. It reveals the holiness of God and shows how sin alienates us from his life-giving presence. It shows the things which God cares about in society. It shows that God is dedicated to the protection of human life. But more than anything, it shows that God is relentless in pursuit of relationship with his people. Next week, I'm going to share with you one clue that Jesus believed himself to be God. This piece of evidence you've probably never heard of before. So get excited. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.